After Alex Trebek's passing, his longtime home in Studio City, Los Angeles, eventually found new owners, a young couple, Daniel and Marissa, who had always admired the charm of mid-century California houses. The property was warm and inviting, with sweeping views of the San Fernando Valley, a lush garden, and the quiet dignity of a place that had once belonged to a man beloved by millions. At first, life in the house seemed idyllic. Daniel, an aspiring writer, set up his desk near the large window in the den, where Trebek had once enjoyed his mornings. Marissa loved tending the garden, imagining that some of the roses still bore the care of the late host himself. Friends envied them for owning a piece of television history, though the couple insisted they wanted the house simply because it felt right. But soon, odd moments began to unsettle them. Daniel noticed that the grandfather clock in the hallway would chime irregularly, even though it had no working mechanism. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, the television in the living room would flicker on by itself, tuned not to a random channel but to old game show reruns. Marissa confessed one evening that while working in the kitchen, she had heard a man's voice, warm, clear, and precise, gently say, "Let's begin." She turned, expecting Daniel, but found the room empty. The disturbances grew subtler but more insistent. The faint sound of applause drifting from nowhere, cards and books left stacked in neat, deliberate piles, and lights in the study glowing late into the night as if someone were still reviewing questions. The couple began to wonder whether they were alone in the house at all or if Trebek's presence lingered, bound not in menace but in the enduring rhythm of a life dedicated to knowledge, ritual, and performance. Though neither Daniel nor Marissa ever felt threatened, both admitted they sometimes hesitated to walk down the hallway at night, for fear of hearing that unmistakable, familiar cadence of a voice still echoing through the walls of their home. Daniel had always considered himself a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts, dismissed talk of energies and presences, and approached the world with a practical, almost stubborn sense of logic. That was why, when he and Marissa first moved into Alex Trebek's house, he thought the strange occurrences were nothing more than quirks of an old property. The place had been standing since the 1920s, with its thick wooden beams, creaking floors, and a living room that carried the faint scent of age and dust no matter how often Marissa scrubbed. He assumed the flickering lights were bad wiring, the strange noises a result of the house settling into the hillsides of Studio City. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the explanations grew harder to hold on to. It began most noticeably with the den. The room was bright during the day, washed in sunlight that poured through wide windows and reflected across the polished wood floors. But at night, something about it changed. Daniel had made it his writing space, but the longer he stayed there past midnight, the more unsettled he felt. It wasn't simply the silence, it was a pressure, a heaviness, as though the air thickened after the clock struck 12. The faint tapping he first thought was a branch outside the window seemed to echo from inside the walls. He'd pause, lift his head, and hear nothing but his own breath. Yet when he set his pen to paper, the tapping would resume, persistent, like someone waiting for him to respond. Marissa experienced the strangeness in gentler, more intimate ways. She often spent her afternoons in the garden, where she claimed the flowers bloomed more quickly than any she had planted before. The roses in particular, rich reds and pale pinks, seemed to respond to her care with unusual vigor. But what disturbed her wasn't the growth, it was the voice. She told Daniel one evening, in a whisper, that as she bent down to prune the stems, she distinctly heard a man say, low but unmistakably kind, "That's correct." She laughed nervously when she recounted it, but her hands trembled, and she avoided looking toward the den as she spoke. Then came the television. The old set in the living room had been left behind when they moved in. Daniel, too stubborn to replace something functional, kept it. More than once, they returned home to find it turned on, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. Each time, it was tuned to reruns of Jeopardy! Not modern episodes but ones from the 1980s and 1990s, the kind that carried Trebek's younger voice, brisk and confident. They never heard the sound when they entered, only the static image of him at the podium, his eyes fixed on the camera in that measured way. Daniel unplugged the television one night, convinced it was faulty wiring. The next evening, they returned home to find the screen glowing again, though the cord still dangled lifeless from the wall. Nights became harder. Marissa woke often to the sound of applause, faint but unmistakable, as though a crowd had gathered somewhere inside the walls. Daniel once rose to investigate, standing barefoot on the cold floorboards of the hallway. The sound seemed to come from the study, the room Alex Trebek had reportedly used as a retreat. When Daniel pushed the door open, the light inside was on. Papers were spread neatly across the desk piles he had never seen before, with words handwritten in tidy lines across index cards. He reached for one, but the moment his fingers brushed it, the papers vanished, leaving the desk bare and gleaming under the soft light. By now, Daniel no longer tried to dismiss the events as tricks of the mind. He had begun to avoid writing at night, too aware of the presence in the den. Marissa grew quiet, spending less time in the garden. But neither wanted to leave. Something about the house compelled them, as though the walls held not menace but expectation. It wasn't a haunting of terror but of persistence, a lingering order, as though someone still lived here, rehearsing, watching, waiting for a question to be answered. What unsettled them most wasn't the voices or the television or the applause, it was the growing sense that they were not merely witnesses but participants. The house seemed to test them, to wait for their responses, as if they, too, had become contestants in a game they hadn't realized they had entered. The days in the house seemed ordinary enough. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors each morning. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and the faint hum of traffic from Ventura Boulevard drifted up the hill. Daniel tried to convince himself that the unease he felt at night was no more than imagination, a side effect of long hours hunched over his writing desk. But there was something about the quiet daylight that made the nights even harder to face, as though the house itself drew strength from the darkness. One evening, as the sky outside turned violet and the lights of the valley began to sparkle below, Marissa lingered in the living room with a book in her lap. Daniel was in the den, typing with slow determination, when she suddenly heard the faint scrape of movement behind her. It was not the shuffle of feet or the creak of the old floorboards, it was softer, like the brush of fabric against wood. She turned her head, expecting to see Daniel coming out of the hallway, but the room was empty. For a long moment she stared at the tall bookshelf, the rows of titles lined in careful order. She could have sworn one of the books had shifted slightly forward, as though nudged from behind. Later that night, Marissa tried to bring it up, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever feel like we're being guided? Like the house wants us to notice certain things?" Daniel only muttered that she was letting the place get into her head, but even as he said it, his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He didn't tell her that he had heard something earlier himself. A whisper, so low he could hardly distinguish words, yet delivered in a precise, deliberate tone. It had sounded like a clue being read, every syllable clipped and exact. The hallway began to feel different. During the day, it was just a narrow stretch of polished wood connecting the rooms. But at night, shadows clung to it, lengthening unnaturally, bending around the corners like they were reluctant to leave. Daniel noticed the grandfather clock again, the one that hadn't worked since before they moved in. Sometimes, in the silence, he would hear the faint tick-tick, as though it had resumed keeping time. Other nights, it would release a single chime, deep and resonant, with no hands on its face to mark the hour. It wasn't long before Marissa began to dream of the house. They weren't nightmares, at least not at first. She would see the living room bathed in golden studio lights, the sofas arranged not as furniture but as audience seating. In the den, instead of Daniel's scattered notebooks, there was a podium, its surface polished, waiting for someone to step behind it. The applause from unseen crowds would swell in her ears until she woke, her chest tight, her palms damp with sweat. When she told Daniel, he avoided her gaze, because he too had begun to dream of standing behind that podium, though in his dream he could never think of the right answer. One night, the television turned on again, this time while they were both awake. The screen lit the room with a bluish glow, and there was Trebek younger, his hair dark and his suit sharp. But the episode wasn't one they could recognize. The contestants' faces were blurred, unrecognizable, and the clues on the board shifted too quickly to read. Trebek's voice was clear, though steady as ever. Your response. The couple sat frozen, watching the blurred figures fumble in silence. And then, as if the camera had shifted, Trebek's eyes seemed to meet theirs through the screen. The sound cut abruptly. The image vanished. Only static remained, hissing into the quiet house. From that night forward, it was no longer possible for them to dismiss what was happening. Objects began to move subtly, never in front of them, but always arranged in ways too deliberate to ignore. Index cards appeared in neat stacks on the coffee table. A pen left on the counter would be placed upright in a cup. Once, Marissa found the dining chairs pulled into 3 precise rows, facing the blank television screen, like an audience waiting for the show to begin. The house had ceased to feel like theirs. It was as though the life that once filled it had never left, merely shifted into another form. Neither Daniel nor Marissa spoke openly about leaving, though the thought lingered in both of their minds. Instead, they moved carefully, almost reverently, through the rooms, aware that they were not the only ones living there. And each night, without fail, they both felt it, the weight of expectation, the sensation that at any moment, a familiar voice might call out to them, presenting a question they could not answer. The breaking point came on a night when the air felt heavier than usual, a stillness pressing down on every corner of the house. Daniel had been sitting at his desk in the den, his pen idle on the page, when the sound of applause erupted again. It was louder this time, not a faint echo, but a full swell, as if hundreds of people were clapping somewhere just out of sight. He stood quickly, his pulse hammering, and turned toward the hallway. The glow of the living room television was spilling under the door, flickering across the floorboards like light from a fire. Marissa was already there, standing rigid in the doorway, her face pale in the bluish light. On the screen was Alex Trebek, not from any episode they recognized, but seated behind a podium, staring out as if addressing an unseen contestant. The board of clues shimmered behind him, but instead of questions, the spaces were blank, glowing white. Trebek leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, steady, and unmistakable. The final question is for you. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The television's hum deepened, vibrating through the floorboards, and he swore he could feel the audience surrounding them now. A press of unseen bodies, the heat of stage lights filling the room. Marissa clutched his arm, whispering, "Don't answer." But the silence stretched, unbearable, until Trebek's eyes seemed to lock with Daniel's, holding him there with quiet insistence. The question never appeared on the screen. Only the empty board, glowing with expectation. Trebek's voice came once more, softer this time, almost compassionate. "Time's up." The screen went dark. The applause stopped instantly, leaving the house in crushing silence. The living room, once so alive with the illusion of a studio, was only a room again, still, dim and empty. The television reflected their pale faces back at them. Nothing more. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances grew fewer. The grandfather clock never chimed again. The whispers faded, and the stacks of index cards disappeared. Yet Daniel and Marissa knew the quiet was not the same as peace. The house seemed watchful, waiting. They carried on their lives, making coffee in the mornings, tending to the garden, walking carefully through the halls at night. But both of them felt it, the lingering presence, not hostile but unyielding, as though the house itself remained a stage and they, the unwilling contestants, had already stepped behind the podium. And though the television never turned on by itself again, Daniel swore he still heard it sometimes, faintly through the walls as he drifted towards sleep. A familiar cadence, a measured tone, the voice of a man asking questions that would never be answered. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?